Steve Harvey has hosted Family Feud for over a decade. He has laughed with families, cried with strangers, and watched people win and lose more times than anyone could count. He has heard almost everything a person can hear on a game show stage. Almost everything, because nothing in 30 years of television prepared him for what a woman named Cheryl Fontaine said into a live microphone on a Tuesday afternoon in February 2024. It was not a game show answer. It was not a joke. It was the kind of truth that, once it leaves a person's mouth, cannot be taken back by anyone, not the woman who said it, not the man it was said about, and not the host standing 3 feet away, whose jaw dropped so far, so fast, that the entire studio audience gasped before he did. This is the story of what happened that day, and more importantly, this is the story of what happened after. If you are watching this for the first time and this kind of story, raw, real, and deeply human, is what you come here for, then hit that like button and subscribe before we go any further. These are the stories that matter. Now let's talk about Cheryl Fontaine. I like this video and subscribe powerful family stories every single week. Cheryl Fontaine was 47 years old, a high school English teacher from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who had taught literature and writing to teenagers for 21 years. She was the kind of teacher students remembered long after they left her classroom. Patient, sharp, warm without being soft, and deeply committed to the idea that words matter, and that how you use them reveals exactly who you are. She had married Darnell Fontaine 23 years earlier when they were both 24 years old and barely a year out of LSU. Darnell was handsome, funny, and ambitious. The kind of man who walked into a room and immediately made it feel more energetic. He worked in commercial real estate and had built a genuinely successful career over 2 decades. Together they had 3 children, twin sons in their early 20s and a 17-year-old daughter named Aaliyah, who was the light of both their lives. From the outside, the Fontaine family looked like exactly what they were. A solid, faith-based, middle-class family who had built something real together over a long stretch of years. They attended church every Sunday. They hosted Thanksgiving for the extended family every year without fail. Their children were well-raised and well-loved. Darnell coached youth basketball on Saturday mornings. Cheryl ran a summer reading program for underprivileged kids in their neighborhood every July. But for the 14 months leading up to that Family Feud taping, Cheryl Fontaine had known something that she had told no one. Not her mother. Not her closest friend of 30 years, a woman named Beverly who called her every Sunday evening without exception. Not her pastor, not a single soul. She had discovered 14 months earlier that Darnell was having an affair. She had not found out through a dramatic confrontation or an anonymous tip. She had found out the way many women find out, quietly, accidentally, while borrowing her husband's phone to look up a restaurant address and seeing a message that was not meant for her eyes. She had put the phone down. She had finished cooking dinner. She had helped Aaliyah with her homework. She had gone to bed that night beside her husband of 22 years and said nothing. And then she had said nothing for 14 more months. Not because she was passive or afraid. Cheryl Fontaine was neither of those things. She had stayed silent because she was a woman who believed in thinking before acting, who had spent 2 decades teaching young people that the most powerful thing you can do with a difficult truth is understand it fully before you respond to it. She wanted to be certain. She wanted to know what she was actually dealing with before she decided what to do about it. So she watched. She paid attention in the quiet, careful way that only a woman who teaches literature for a living truly can. Reading subtext, tracking patterns, noticing the small things that most people miss. And over 14 months, she had built a picture that was complete and undeniable. The affair had been ongoing. It was not a single mistake. And Darnell had made no move whatsoever to end it or to tell her the truth. The Family Feud application had been submitted by Cheryl's sister-in-law, Darnell's younger sister Monique, who had put the family forward as a fun group activity 6 months before the taping date was confirmed. The lineup was Cheryl, Darnell, Monique, Cheryl's brother Raymond, and Cheryl's daughter Aaliyah, who had just turned 17 and was thrilled to be part of the family outing. Cheryl had agreed to participate without hesitation. She had her reasons. and they would become clear to everyone in that studio very soon. The drive to the taping in Los Angeles had been quiet. Not uncomfortably so. Monique filled the silence cheerfully, as she always did, talking about the show and the prize money and what she would do if they won. Aaliyah had her earbuds in and was smiling at her phone. Raymond napped in the back seat. Darnell drove. Cheryl sat in the passenger's seat watching the freeway pass and thinking about exactly what she had been thinking about for 14 months. She had made a decision the week before. She was not entirely sure what was going to happen inside that studio or whether the moment would present itself the way she imagined it. But she had decided that she was done carrying this alone. She was done performing the role of the unaware wife while her husband performed the role of the faithful husband beside her. She was an English teacher. She understood, better than most, that silence can be a form of complicity, and she was no longer willing to be complicit in a lie that was being told at her expense. What she did not plan, and could not have planned, was the specific way the truth would come out, because what happened on that stage was not a calculated move. It was a human being reaching a limit. Beat 2. Backstory surfaces. The Fontaine family made it through the main game without incident. They were a naturally competitive group. Raymond, in particular, played with an intensity that drew laughs from the audience, and they moved through the rounds with energy and humor. Darnell was charming on camera, as he always was. He put his arm around Cheryl during a break between rounds, and she let him, because Aaliyah was watching, and because she was still deciding. They won the main game and advanced to fast money. The family decided Monique would go first, and Cheryl would anchor the second round. Monique stepped up and scored 121 points, a strong number that put the family in a good position. She came back beaming. Cheryl stepped forward. Steve Harvey greeted her with his signature warmth. He asked her name, where she was from, what she did. She told him she was a high school English teacher from Baton Rouge. Steve made a joke about how English teachers made him nervous. All that grammar. Cheryl laughed. It was a real laugh. Steve noticed her eyes, the way teachers' eyes often are, sharp, observant, and carrying a great deal more than the surface expression suggests. He said, almost as an aside, "You look like a woman who knows exactly what she wants to say." It was a throwaway line, the kind of quick read he does instinctively with every contestant. But Cheryl looked at him for just a moment too long before she answered. "More than you know," she said. And again the microphone caught it. The fast money round began. Cheryl needed 79 points to win the 20,000 for her family. She answered all 5 questions with the calm, methodical focus of a woman who had been preparing for high-stakes moments her entire career. When the answers were revealed, she had scored 91 points. The Fontaine family had won. The studio erupted. Monique screamed and grabbed Aaliyah. Raymond pumped both fists. Darnell clapped and whooped from the family section, grinning wide. Cheryl did not move. She stood at the podium with both hands resting flat on the surface, her expression completely composed, looking at something that no one else in the room could identify. Steve Harvey walked toward her with his arms slightly open, ready to celebrate, and then, the way he always does when something is off, he stopped. "Cheryl," he said carefully, "you just won 20,000. You okay?" She turned and looked at her husband, who was still smiling broadly from the family section. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned back to Steve and said, "Can I say something? Right now, on camera." Steve Harvey is a man who has spent his career reading rooms. He understood in that single sentence that whatever was about to happen was not a joke, not a game show moment, and not something he could redirect with humor. He said, steadily and without hesitation, "Go ahead." The studio quieted with a speed that felt almost physical, like the air pressure in the room had changed. Aaliyah had stopped smiling. Monique went very still. Raymond, who had been in the middle of a celebration high five with the audience member next to him, let his hand fall slowly to his side. Darnell's smile faded. Cheryl looked at her husband, and she spoke to him directly, not to Steve, not to the camera, not to the audience. She spoke the way she had always spoken in the hardest moments of her life. Clearly, deliberately, and without performance. She told him that she knew. She told him she had known for 14 months. She told him that she had spent those 14 months watching him come home to their family every night and sit at their dinner table and pray over their food and hold their daughter's hand at church, while conducting himself as something he was not. She told him that she had stayed silent for a long time because she had needed to understand what she was looking at before she responded to it. And she said that she had now understood it completely. She told him, in front of the studio audience, the production crew, the cameras, Steve Harvey, their daughter, his sister, and her brother, that she was not going to pretend anymore. That she refused to spend one more day performing a marriage that only one of them was actually inside, and that she needed him to look at her and understand that she was not speaking from anger. She was speaking from a woman who had made up her mind. Beat 5. The community witnesses. The studio was so quiet that the ventilation system was audible. Alia had both hands over her mouth. Her eyes were wide and filling rapidly with tears. Not because she didn't understand what was happening, but because at 17 years old, a part of her had already suspected something was wrong at home and had never been able to name it. Hearing her mother name it out loud in the clearest possible language was simultaneously devastating and clarifying in a way that she would only fully process much later. Monique stood completely still, her celebration joy entirely gone. She and Darnell had grown up together. She loved her brother, but she also loved Cheryl, had loved her for 23 years, and in the expression on Cheryl's face, she saw something she recognized as absolute truth. Raymond had not moved since Cheryl began speaking. He stood with his arms at his sides and his jaw set and his eyes fixed on his brother-in-law with an expression that did not require any words at all. Darnell stood in the family section and said nothing. His face had gone through several things in rapid succession. Surprise, then something that looked like the beginning of a denial, then a stillness that was harder to read. He looked at his wife. He did not look away. Steve Harvey stood between them and absorbed what had just happened. He took a breath. He did not speak immediately, which for a man whose instinct is always to fill silence, was itself a statement. Beat 6. The breaking point when Steve finally spoke, he addressed Cheryl first. He asked her quietly if she was all right. She said yes. That she was more all right in that moment than she had been in 14 months, which was the truest thing she said all day. He then turned slowly toward Darnell. The camera caught the moment his eyes moved from Cheryl to her husband. The audience watched Steve Harvey's expression shift, not to anger, not to judgment, but to the kind of gravity that a man carries when he is about to say something he means entirely. "Sir," Steve said, "your wife just stood up in front of the world and told you the truth. What are you going to do with it?" The whole room waited. What happened next was not what anyone in that room expected. It was not what the producers expected. It was not what Steve Harvey expected. And based on the expression on her face, it was not entirely what Cheryl Fontaine expected either. Darnell Fontaine walked forward from the family section. He did not speak as he walked. He crossed the stage slowly, and when he reached his wife, he stopped directly in front of her. He looked at her for a long moment, his face open in a way that Cheryl later described as a face she had not seen since early in their marriage. Before success and comfort, and the accumulated weight of years had taught him to keep things behind glass. And then Darnell Fontaine did something that nobody in that studio would forget for the rest of their lives. He got down on one knee, not as a romantic gesture, not as a performance for the cameras. He got down on one knee because he was a man who had just been completely, publicly, and accurately seen, and who, in that moment of total exposure, made the only choice his conscience had left him. He looked up at his wife and he said, "You're right. All of it. And I am sorry. I am sorry in a way that I don't have the words for right now. But I need you to know that I understand what I've done, and I understand what it cost you to carry this the way you did." He paused. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. But I am asking for the chance to earn it, however long that takes. Whatever it requires." Cheryl looked down at her husband for a very long time. Her face was unreadable in the way that only extremely composed people can be unreadable. Not because she felt nothing, but because she felt everything at once and was choosing carefully among all of it. Then she said, "Get up, Darnell." He stood. She looked at him. directly, without flinching. "I didn't do this to humiliate you. I did this because I have been invisible in my own marriage for over a year and I needed someone to see me. I needed you to have nowhere to hide." She paused. "Now we both have nowhere to hide. So we either figure out what that means, or we don't. But I'm not going back to pretending." Steve Harvey, who had stood back and given the moment its full space, stepped forward. His voice was quieter than his audience was accustomed to hearing from him. "Cheryl, I want to say something to you." He looked directly at her. "What you just did took more strength than most people will ever find. You didn't do it to destroy your family. You did it to save it. And whether or not your family understands that right now, I want you to hear it from me. I see exactly what you did and why you did it, and it was brave." He then turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have been doing this for a long time. I have seen a lot of things happen on this stage. But what I just watched is something I want you to think about on your way home tonight. This woman did not come here to make a scene. She came here because she needed to be heard. And sometimes, in a marriage, in a family, in any relationship, the only way to be heard is to say the thing out loud that everyone has been pretending not to know." He paused and let the room sit with that for a moment. "Darnell, I don't know you, but I know what I just saw you do. And I want to say this clearly: the fact that you walked up there and got on your knee without being asked, without thinking about the cameras, without calculating anything, that tells me there is something in you worth saving. The question is whether you're willing to do the actual work to save it." Darnell, standing beside his wife, said simply, "I am." Alia had come forward from the family section by then. She stood at the edge of the stage and looked at her parents, her mother composed and upright, her father standing beside her with red eyes and both hands at his sides. Alia was the one who crossed the remaining distance. She put her arms around her mother first, and then, after a pause that said everything about the complexity of what she was feeling, she reached one arm out and included her father. The studio, which had been frozen in near total silence, broke open. The applause started slowly and built into something that felt less like a game show audience and more like a community of people recognizing something true about the world they all lived in. Steve Harvey stood back, arms folded, and for once in his long career said absolutely nothing. He just watched. And the expression on his face, which the cameras caught in full, was not entertainment. It was something closer to awe, resolution, lesson, community impact, universal application. The episode aired 4 weeks after taping. The production team had debated internally about how to handle the segment, whether to edit it, shorten it, or frame it differently in post-production. In the end, they broadcast it largely as it happened, with minimal interruption, because everyone who watched the raw footage agreed on one thing: any editing would diminish it. The moment was complete exactly as it was. The response was unlike anything the show had seen since its early years. The clip was shared more than 3 million times within the first 24 hours. It was covered by every major entertainment outlet and many mainstream news organizations. Social media was flooded not with the usual commentary, but with something more rare. People writing at length about their own marriages, their own silences, their own moments of choosing to stay quiet when the truth needed to be spoken. The reactions split broadly into 2 camps, and both were represented loudly. One camp saw Cheryl's decision as reckless, an airing of private pain in a public forum that put her daughter in an impossible position and robbed her husband of the dignity of a private reckoning. The other camp saw it as a woman who had exhausted every private option and understood, with the clarity of someone who had been carrying a secret alone for over a year, that a private reckoning was never going to happen unless she forced one. Both perspectives had merit. Cheryl addressed both of them openly in the weeks that followed. In her first interview after the broadcast, a 45-minute conversation with a journalist from a national magazine, Cheryl was careful, thoughtful, and unflinching. She acknowledged that choosing a live television stage was unconventional. She acknowledged that her daughter's presence made it more complicated, and that she had spent significant time after the taping talking with Aaliyah about what had happened and what it meant. She was honest that she did not know, going into that studio, exactly what she was going to do. She had known only that she had reached the end of her capacity to perform a life she was no longer living inside. She also said something that became one of the most quoted lines from the entire episode, more quoted even than anything Steve Harvey had said on stage. "I am an English teacher. I have spent 21 years teaching young people that the words you choose either build something or destroy something. For 14 months I chose silence, and my silence built nothing. It just insulated a lie that was living in my house. I finally chose words. And whatever comes next, I can live with words. I could not keep living with silence." What came next was genuinely complicated, and the Fontaines were honest about that in every interview they gave. Darnell moved out of the family home 2 weeks after the taping. They began an intensive couples therapy process with a therapist who specialized in infidelity recovery, a woman with decades of experience who was direct with both of them from the beginning that rebuilding trust after sustained betrayal was not a linear process, was not guaranteed, and could not be rushed. For several months the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Darnell had work to do that was entirely his own, an honest accounting of why he had made the choices he made, and what they said about who he was and who he wanted to become. Cheryl had her own work to do, processing a grief she had postponed for over a year, learning to be angry in a way that was honest rather than managed, and deciding, with clear eyes and a full accounting of all available information, whether she wanted to rebuild this marriage or end it. Their daughter Aaliyah, to her enormous credit, handled the aftermath with a maturity that both parents said was humbling. She was in her own therapy within 3 weeks of the taping. She was honest with her therapist, and eventually with her parents, that she had known something was wrong at home for a long time, and that having it spoken aloud, as brutal as the manner of speaking had been, was a relief she had not expected. She told her mother, in one conversation that Cheryl described as one of the most important of her life, "Mom, I always knew you were the strongest person in our house. Now everybody else knows it too." Steve Harvey referenced the Fontaine family multiple times in the months following the broadcast. On his talk show, he devoted an extended segment to the episode, not to recap the drama, but to unpack what he believed it said about something most people struggle to do: the willingness to refuse a comfortable lie when a painful truth is the only honest option available. He made a distinction that generated significant conversation on its own. "There is a difference," he said, "between a woman who exposes her husband to hurt him and a woman who tells the truth because she has run out of any other way to stay alive inside her own life." Cheryl Fontaine was the second kind. I have met both kinds. I know the difference, and I want everybody watching to understand that what she did was not revenge. It was survival. Monique, Darnell's sister, gave a single interview in which she was as honest as she could be about the complexity of loving both people at the center of a betrayal. She said that watching her brother get on one knee on that stage had broken her heart and repaired something in her simultaneously, that it told her the man she had grown up with was still somewhere inside the man who had made those choices, and that she intended to hold him accountable to becoming him again. "I love my brother," she said, "but I love Cheryl too, and what Darnell did to her is not something I will minimize because he is family. Being family means I hold him to a higher standard, not a lower one." Raymond, Cheryl's brother, said almost nothing publicly. He was, by family accounts, the person Cheryl leaned on most heavily in the weeks after the taping. He drove to Baton Rouge and stayed for 10 days. He fixed things around the house. He took Aaliyah to school in the mornings so that Cheryl could sleep a little later. He did not discuss the episode or analyze it or offer opinions. He simply showed up. Cheryl said in her interview that his presence during those weeks was one of the things that steadied her most, and that he had been that way her entire life. 1 year after the episode aired, Cheryl and Darnell Fontaine were still married and still in therapy. They were careful in every public statement not to wrap their story in a resolution it had not yet fully earned. They did not go on television to announce that everything was fine. They were not that kind of people, and theirs was not that kind of story. What they did do together was Participate in a panel discussion on marriage, betrayal, and recovery hosted by a family counseling organization in New Orleans. It was not a large event, perhaps 200 people in a hotel conference room, and it was not televised, but the organization's director said afterward that it was the most attended, most engaged, and most emotionally significant event they had hosted in 15 years of running such programs. Cheryl spoke about what it had cost her to stay silent for 14 months. The way it had slowly changed her, made her smaller, turned her watchfulness into a kind of numbness. She spoke about the moment she decided she was done, not the moment on the stage, but the quieter moment the week before, alone in her classroom after her students had left, when she had finally admitted to herself that she could not teach young people that words and truth matter while living a life organized entirely around the opposite. Darnell spoke about accountability. Not the word, but the actual practice of it. He spoke about the difference between saying sorry and doing the work that makes sorry mean something. He said that the most important thing he had learned in the year since the taping was that he had confused the performance of being a good man with actually being one, and that those two things are not the same, and that the gap between them, when it finally catches up with a person, is exactly as wide as all the choices that created it. In the audience that night was a couple who had driven 4 hours from Shreveport, Louisiana, because the wife had recognized something of her own life in Cheryl's story and had wanted her husband to hear Cheryl speak in person. After the panel, the wife approached Cheryl and told her that watching the Family Feud clip had given her the language for something she had been trying to articulate to her husband for 2 years. She said she had shown him the clip and that he had watched it in silence and then looked at her and said, "Is that what's happening with us?" And she had said yes, and they had finally talked. Cheryl listened to the woman and held her hands and said, simply, "That is everything. That is all of it." Steve Harvey, in a follow-up interview a year after the episode, was asked what he thought about the Fontaine family and how their story had unfolded. He took a moment before answering. Then he said, "Cheryl Fontaine walked onto my stage and told the truth at full cost to herself, with no guarantee of how it would land. That is not something most people are capable of. What I hope her story does is remind people that the truth, as hard as it is, as much as it costs, as unpredictable as the consequences are, is always the beginning of something real. The lie is never the beginning of anything real. It's only ever the beginning of more lie." He paused. She chose real. And that is a choice that will keep paying forward for the rest of her life. The Fontaine family's story does not end with a bow tied around it. It ends the way most honest stories end. In the middle of something still being figured out by real people doing the slow, unglamorous work of becoming more true to themselves and to each other than they were before. Cheryl still teaches English in Baton Rouge. She still runs the summer reading program every July. She still chooses her words with the precision of a woman who has spent a lifetime understanding that they are the most powerful tools any person possesses. Aaliyah graduated from high school the following spring and enrolled at Tulane University in the fall. At her graduation dinner, she gave a small toast. She said, "I want to thank my mom for teaching me that speaking the truth is always braver than protecting a lie. And I want to thank my dad for proving that it is never too late to choose the truth back." She looked at both of them. "I love you both. Now let's eat." The table laughed, and for the first time in a long time, it was the kind of laughter that does not have anything hiding underneath it,